For centuries, religion has served as both a guide for personal belief and a tool wielded by those in power. When we look at religious texts like the Bible, we often see not just spiritual teachings, but reflections of the societies that created them. This video will explore how certain biblical narratives, often viewed as divine commands, were shaped by historical realities, and later used to justify social systems like slavery. It's important to note that this is not a dismissal of personal faith. Instead, we're diving into the historical context behind these teachings, examining how religion has been used over time, both to inspire and to control. Let's start by addressing a passage often cited in discussions of slavery, Ephesians 6:5. This verse advises slaves to obey their earthly masters with respect and fear and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. On the surface, this seems like an endorsement of a deeply immoral system. But to understand it fully, we must consider the world in which it was written. A world where slavery was not only accepted, but seen as a part of the natural order. Religious texts, such as the Bible, didn't create slavery. They reflect the norms of the societies that produced them. The world of the Bible, particularly in the Old and New Testaments, was one where hierarchical systems, including slavery, were ubiquitous. What we often interpret as divine endorsement of these systems is more a reflection of ancient social realities. Slavery in the ancient world. Slavery didn't begin with European colonialism or the American South. In fact, it has existed for thousands of years, long before Christianity, and it was a common practice in many ancient civilizations. The Mesopotamians, Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans all relied on slavery to fuel their economies and sustain their empires. In this context, it's no surprise that the Bible, as a product of these times, mentions slavery without condemning it. For example, ancient Mesopotamian texts like the Epic of Atra-Hasis provide an earlier framework for understanding how people viewed servitude. In this myth, humans were created to bear the burdens of the gods, essentially, to serve them. This story prefigures later biblical narratives and reveals how deeply embedded the concept of servitude was in the ancient mind. Similarly, the Enuma Elish, another Mesopotamian creation myth, describes how the god Marduk created humans to relieve the gods of labor. This idea of humanity as servants to a higher power isn't unique to Mesopotamia. It can be found in other ancient religious traditions as well, including the Bible. The idea that humans were created to serve divine purposes would later be reflected in the way religious leaders and rulers interpreted their texts. Biblical justification for slavery. Moving forward in time to the Roman Empire, we find that slavery was an integral part of society. Early Christians, many of whom were living under Roman rule, did not actively seek to dismantle this system. Instead, Christian teachings often advised slaves to submit to their masters, and masters to treat their slaves kindly. This wasn't a radical rejection of slavery, but rather a call to moral behavior within the existing system. Consider Romans 6:16, which states, "Don't you know that when you offer yourselves to someone as obedient slaves, you are slaves of the one you obey?" This could be seen as a spiritual metaphor, yet it reflects the material reality of the time. For early Christians, the institution of slavery was a given. The church offered guidance on how to navigate it, but it did not challenge its existence. What's fascinating, though, is how these teachings were later appropriated by those in power to justify the expansion of slavery in other contexts, especially during the transatlantic slave trade. European colonizers used the Bible to legitimize their actions, twisting scripture to suggest that slavery was not only permissible but ordained by God. In this way, passages that once served to provide moral direction in the Roman Empire became tools of oppression and domination. The role of religion in control. Throughout history, we've seen religious texts used to support systems of control. Leviticus 25:44, for example, says, "However, you may purchase a male or female slave from among the nations around you." Such passages were used by slaveholders to justify the ownership of human beings, framing slavery as something acceptable in the eyes of God. But again, we must remember that these texts were written in times when slavery was widespread and accepted. They reflect the social norms of their day, rather than divine mandates. The real question is how these teachings were interpreted and, more importantly, manipulated by those seeking power. In medieval Europe, the Roman Catholic Church was a major force, not only in spiritual matters but also in politics and economics. The Church amassed incredible wealth and influence, often using scripture to legitimize its dominance. Concepts like the divine right of kings suggested that rulers derived their authority directly from God, making opposition to them not just treason, but heresy. By blending religious and political authority, the Church was able to maintain control over vast populations for centuries, fear as a tool for control. One of the most powerful tools religion has used throughout history is fear. Fear of punishment, fear of hell, fear of divine retribution. These are potent motivators. The concept of hell, for instance, became deeply ingrained in Christian doctrine over time, even though it wasn't originally a central feature of early Christian teachings. The idea of eternal punishment, such as burning in a lake of fire, became particularly popular in the medieval period. Fear of damnation kept people in line, encouraging obedience to both religious and secular authorities. But here's the thing. The idea of hell as we know it today is a relatively recent addition to Christian doctrine. It wasn't until the 19th century that ideas like the rapture and the lake of fire became more mainstream, and these concepts were heavily influenced by figures like John Nelson Darby, who added the idea of the rapture to Christian theology in the early 1800s. Why is this significant? Because it shows us how religion evolves over time, adapting to new social, political, and even economic realities. Fear, once used to inspire awe and reverence, was weaponized by religious authorities to exert control. Reinterpreting scripture for power. Let's not forget that religious texts have always been subject to interpretation. What may seem like a clear command from God is often the product of human intervention. Take the example of the lake of fire, a concept associated with eternal damnation. This imagery has been used throughout history to frighten people into submission. But much like the rapture, it was a later addition to Christian doctrine, introduced to heighten the stakes of religious adherence. Similarly, the Bible's portrayal of slavery as a natural part of life was embraced by colonial powers seeking to expand their empires. By framing their conquest and exploitation of other peoples as divinely sanctioned, European powers were able to maintain control over vast territories and populations. Conclusion: a new understanding. When we study these religious teachings through a historical lens, it becomes clear that they were not always meant to be taken literally. Rather, they reflect the values, beliefs, and social structures of the times in which they were written. Religion, in many cases, has been used to justify the status quo, reinforcing systems of power and control. By understanding the historical context behind these teachings, we can better understand how they've been manipulated throughout history. Religion has been both a force for good and a tool of oppression, depending on how it's been used. It's up to us, today, to discern the difference and seek out the truths that resonate with our understanding of justice and equality. If you found this analysis insightful, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Historical Highway for more in-depth explorations of history's most fascinating ideas and events.